Okay.
Yeah, okay,
All right, we're on now, so we're
okay.
going to get started here. Okay. We're talking today with Jim Roach of Oxford, Pennsylvania, and the interviewer is Jane Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay. Now start us off with a little bit of background. To begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Misericordia Hospital, 1947.
Okay. Did you grow up in Philadelphia or
I
move
grew up
out?
in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I grew up in Delaware County, which is the first county to the west of the Philadelphia County.
Mm-hmm.
Media, which is the county seat, is where I was born, where my parents lived when I was
Yeah.
born. Then we moved to Ridley Park during my grade school years, and then in high school, I was in Darby, Pennsylvania, and went to Monsignor Bonner. Graduated in 1965.
Okay. Now what did your family do for a living while you were growing up?
My father, neither my mother or my father had very much education. Neither had completed high school, but that didn't seem to be uncommon among their generation. My father worked for the federal government for the Forestry Service, and primarily as a duplication machine operator, a Xerox, back when Xerox was
Or
unknown,
mimeograph or something like that.
mimeographs and all those sorts of things. But he worked and retired from the Forestry Service. I guess he worked there 30 or 40 years and retired in Pennsylvania. And they moved from their house over to an apartment and lived there the last part of their life.
All right. And how many kids were in the family?
There were 5. I was the oldest of 5. And when I was growing up, I went to Catholic grade school. My family was very Catholic. And when you're going to Catholic grade school, they teach you there are 3 vocations in life. One is religious, one is single, and one is married. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, but that's what they teach you. And every time a priest would visit the classroom, the question is how many boys or girls have a vocation. But what that meant was how many have a religious vocation. And I was always one of the good little boys that raised his hand. And I ended up going to Maryknoll Seminary after I graduated from high school. Only lasted 1 semester because you have to, in college there's work to be done, and I wasn't ready to do work. So I learned how to play pool, I learned how to play handball, but that's about all I learned in that 6 months at Maryknoll Seminary. So I left seminary, came home, and was kind of at loose ends, had a job working in retail. I was the assistant manager of a small store. There were only 2 people working in the store, the manager and the assistant manager, so that got old pretty quick. And I realized I was probably going to be drafted. This was in 1966, spring of 1966. So I went down and to the Army recruiter, took the test, the ASVAB, which is the Army Vocational something test, aptitude test, and they said, you're qualified to go to the Army Warrant Officer Flight Program, which means you become a helicopter pilot. Well, that sounded pretty cool to me, so I signed up for that. Went to basic training in Fort Polk, Louisiana. Most of the people going through Fort Polk basic training were going to the infantry. It's just the way the Army had structured at that time. And the second week of training on Saturday, I remember the first sergeant came out and said, everybody with a high school degree, fall out down here. My basic training company probably had 180 people in it. Of those 180, about a dozen of us had a high school degree. The Army was a very different place back then.
Right.
And they marched us into a classroom and brought a lieutenant in. And if you're a trainee, you don't normally see lieutenants close up, so we were very impressed. And he told us how our country needed us in Vietnam, and he just kept talking, and a lot I didn't understand. But at the end of his talk, he said, who here will volunteer for OCS? And I was one of the ones that raised my hand. Then he asked, are there any questions? And I said, what is OCS? And I could see the lieutenant do a double take and look at the sergeant in the back room, who brought this guy in here? So that's how I ended up going to infantry OCS.
All right. Now, did you go through the full basic training first before OCS?
Yes.
All right.
Went through basic training, and the Army would then send you through AIT,
Right.
Advanced Individual Training, and instead of doing anything with helicopters, it switched, and I ended up going to infantry, AIT.
Okay. Now, let's back up a little bit to the arrival at Fort Polk. What sort of reception do you get when you come in as a new recruit?
We flew from Philadelphia down to Houston, Love Airfield. I remember it was the second time I'd been on an airplane, so I was kind of impressed. And it was a 707, a modern jet aircraft, and we landed down at Love Airfield, and we had about a 3 or 4 hour wait. Then we got on a DC-3, an older airplane, prop airplane, and we flew from there over to Louisiana, Fort Polk, and we flew through a thunderstorm, and just about everybody got sick. Well, my stomach was a little stronger, and I was one of the last ones to get sick. And one of the problems with that was they'd run out of bags, air sickness bags. So I had a pullover sweatshirt, and that became my air sickness bag. And when I left the airplane, it just got left on the floor. Well, when you leave the airplane, right away, they have drill sergeants there, and they have these yellow footsteps, following the yellow footsteps. Well, I fall in the yellow footsteps, but I'm still sick, and I'm swaying, and all this stuff, and drill sergeant shouting in my ear, "What's wrong with you, recruit? Are you drunk?" "No, Sergeant, I'm sick." So they took us, marched us over, and you spend 2 or 3 days in the reception station, which is the place where they process you and you get a haircut and they record all types of data. They issue you your uniforms before you go to the basic training company. And while you're in reception station, it's common, there's a rotation for KP. And, but it was very common that each trainee only did it 1 day. Well, I did it 3 days in a row. And I found out at the end it was a joke that my drill sergeant was playing on the mess hall sergeant. He had bet the mess hall sergeant that he had roaches in his mess hall. And my name is Roach. So they had made some type of bet, and so he put me on KP 3 days, and at the end I found out why I was there. It was because of my last name, the son of a bitch. But, just the way it goes. Then we're off to basic training. Basic training's 8 weeks long, march, shoot.
How easy or hard was it for you to adjust to life in the Army?
After going through 12 years of Catholic grade school, or Catholic school, 8 years grade school, 4 years of high school, once I figured out those guys in the round hat, the drill sergeants, were kind of like the nuns in Catholic grade school. I had no problem. You just don't call them sister, but after that, it's no problem. Because when I was in Catholic grade school, when I was in first grade, there were 100 kids in my classroom. One of the requirements for the teachers that taught first grade was size, because as a first grader, I had to turn sideways to get down the aisle. A normal sized adult wouldn't be able to get up down the aisles. So they had these little sisters that taught first grade. I think one of the requirements was size. By the time I got to 8th grade, I think we had 65 people in that classroom. Now, since then, I've gone through a lot of education. I ended up getting a master's degree in educational administration. And I know that the ideal class size is 15 to 20, and 30 is considered pushing the outer limits. But my entire experience during grade school was dealing with all these, and the sisters had to know how to organize it. And all the stuff that you do in the Army, like sizing, I'd done that before. Because when you got time to file out of the classroom, you line up on the side of the wall, face your right. If you're taller than the person in front of you, step forward. And I'd done all that. It was not a problem. So my transformation into the Army, I had a very good foundation in Catholic grade school and Catholic high school.
What kind of physical condition were you in when you went in?
I think I was not exceptional. I think I was just kind of a normal 19-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old. But the Army was good, and I was sound, so the physical conditioning we had hurt. I mean, it required effort and all that sort of thing, but I got stronger.
And what time of year was it that you got to Fort Polk?
It was in the summertime, because I enlisted May 10th, was my basic pay entry date. So then I was at Fort Polk, Louisiana, probably for basic training, late May, probably May 20th to like July 20th or thereabouts.
Right.
And I went from there on a train. We went over to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for AIT. That's still pretty far down south, not as far down south as Louisiana, but still pretty hot. And then I spent 2 months there and another month as a holdover. Holdover was a temporary holding place until there was place for you in OCS. So I was a acting drill sergeant. During that time, you had stripes, and that time you sewed them on your sleeve. And at that time, we were starching uniforms. And what that meant was that after you starched a few times, even when you took off those stripes, there was a shadow there. And so when I got to basic training, or excuse me, when I got to Officers Candidate School, I paid for that. And I paid for it because senior candidates would come up to you and say, "Oh, Candidate Roach, I thought you were Candidate Roach, but you're Sergeant Roach." And it very quickly became obvious that I was going to have to get new uniforms. That was the only way around this. Couldn't buy just new shirts, because part of the way that the uniforms back then, I think they was the dye, they would fade. They wouldn't fade totally up, but they would fade. You could definitely tell the difference between a uniform that you had just bought the shirt and you'd had the pants for 2 months. You definitely tell the difference in the color. That was called a golf uniform in Officer Candidate School. You weren't allowed to have that. So you had to go buy the uniform and had to be tailored, which was very strange because fatigues, they're supposed to be for heavy fatigue work. But we had gotten into this thing in the Army. I was told it started in the Korea War, where starching fatigues and spit shining boots, all this type of stuff, which made it really not a very functional work uniform. But that was what we did then. And when I went through OCS, that was just part of the drill, and you just had to deal with it. If you couldn't deal with it, you didn't get through OCS.
All right.
So
now we want to back up a little bit in this training experience again. Now back in basic training, you said that most of the guys that you were training alongside did not even have a high school education at that point.
That's correct.
And what were...
When I was in basic training, to elaborate on that, each platoon had 3 drill sergeants, so they could rotate. So I think we had 5 platoons, so it was about 15 drill sergeants. Mm-hmm. Of the 15 drill sergeants we had, 1 had a GED, and he was the educated one. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't only the trainees, it was the previous generations of the Army that education, civilian education, was not nearly as important as it is today, and not required as it is today.
Right. And what were the backgrounds of the guys that were they all from different parts of the country or mostly from certain sections?
It seemed that they were mostly from the South. Mm-hmm. Of course, this is 40-some years ago.
Yeah.
One of the funny things happened, I was the only guy that was from north of the Mason-Dixon line. And I didn't consider myself to be a fast talker, but they sure did. Mm-hmm. And I had a very different accent than they did. And I remember when I was in basic training, I got to be the platoon guide, they called it. They needed somebody, a trainee, to be in charge of the basic trainees in the barracks, mm-hmm. organize the cleaning and that sort of thing. And I got to be that, and I found out the reason I got to be that was that one day the company commander, like at the end of the second week, walks out, looks down, and in front of the barracks, I'm standing up on the steps, and the entire platoon is gathered around me. And they're all listening. Well, he's far enough away, he doesn't know what's happening, he just knows they're all listening. He says, "That young man has leadership." What he didn't know is I was standing there, and they put me up there and say, "Hey, Yank, say Brasso." So they just thought I talked funny, and that's what that whole thing was about. But at any rate, seeing most people from the South, and most were from the Deep South. I don't know if that was just in that class, and I can't tell you if that was accurate because it's 40 years ago. And
sure.
I don't know.
About what proportion of them were black?
A small proportion.
Okay.
I would say certainly less than 10%.
Yeah.
We had black soldiers, but I don't remember very many.
All right. Now, within the basic training thing, did they kind of just keep to themselves, or was everybody doing all the same stuff?
Well, when you're basic training, you don't have any choice. You're all doing the same stuff.
Right.
During my early years in the Army, I was in units where the blacks were very much just part of, the skin color was irrelevant. Mm-hmm. I was also in units where the skin color was the critical factor. And that was, in the places I'm thinking about, was normally where the blacks had decided among themselves that they were going to hang together. And I remember I had a situation where, when I was a company commander, all the blacks in the company wanted to be in the same platoon. And we don't work that way. But that was a sensitive and heated discussion with a few of these young soldiers because they felt that somehow they had been mistreated. I couldn't find any evidence of that, and the people that I was dealing with, I trusted, the platoon leaders and this sort of stuff, that they weren't going to mistreat somebody just because of color. But their perspective was different and thought they needed to be together in a separate platoon. Never came to that, but some people definitely had that and wanted to do that.
Okay. So it's an issue at times. Now, when you went to Fort Polk, now Fort Polk later on, especially the AIT at Fort Polk, gets the reputation of being, Tiger Land and Little Vietnam and that kind of thing.
Right.
At that early a stage, was the camp already kind of specializing in Vietnam?
Yes, AIT was Tigerland, and most of the basic trainees that I went through basic training with went from there to Tigerland to Vietnam. I went from there to Fort Jackson, AIT,
Yeah.
then Fort Benning, and 6 months later, then to Vietnam. So,
All right. So when you went to Fort Jackson, then what was in the program for AIT there?
Advanced Infantry Training was small unit tactics, weapons. The only weapon that you shot in basic training was your rifle, which when I went through basic training was still the M14, which is a 7.62 rifle. And it was a big thing back then, the M16, which variants are still in use today. But the M16, which was a smaller projectile, but it was sufficient for the ranges at which we were fighting. And the other advantage is because it's a smaller projectile and smaller bullet, you can carry more rounds.
Right.
So, but somebody sold that rifle and the whole concept. And the first ones I brought to Vietnam, there were a lot of problems with maintenance because it was high tolerances, and if it wasn't clean, there were problems with the rifle. Eventually, within a year or so, they got cleaned up, but there were some. The Army, any big organization doesn't like bad news, and the first guys that complained about the rifle got hammered. Luckily, I got there to Vietnam in 1960, December of '67. Most of that had been resolved, and by this time we had rifles, M16 rifles, that didn't have serious problems. But earlier guys really got hammered about that.
Yeah. Well, some of the early stuff about it, there were claims or assumptions that it didn't need cleaning or other things like that. Of course, then they jam, and you had enough dead GIs after a while that they changed their minds.
To prove that it did.
Yeah. All right. Now, for you though, let's see. The Fort Jackson AT, was that geared toward people who were going to go to OCS, or was that just a general infantry school?
It seemed to be a general infantry school. We had quite a few guys that were in that class with me that ended up in OCS with me. So it seemed that was the route. They sent people that were going to go to infantry OCS. So.
Now, did you have more people from a broader area of the country? Were there any more Yankees down there, or were you still by yourself?
There were a few more Yankees. It wasn't as southern, but still the majority were southern.
Right. And was AIT sort of run differently from basic? Did you have a little bit more respect or freedom or something?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't remember that at all. Matter of fact, the Army instituted one-stop training a decade after I went through basic training. And now if you join the Army to be infantry, you go to Fort Benning, Georgia, and the whole thing, basic training AIT, is all one long thing. And so when you're a trainee in the Army, you're at the very bottom. Trainee is below private. You know, you're striving for the exalted rank of private. Although you're already being paid as a private, you don't feel like you've attained full status yet.
All right. Now, the people who were training you either at Polk or at Jackson, had any of them actually been to Vietnam by then?
Yes, there were quite a few. That was companies, tactical units, and the training base were the places where people rotated out of. And so we had quite a few people with CIBs because I was in infantry training. So CIB is an indication that you've been in combat. But we had quite a few that had CIBs, yeah.
And did they share any of their experiences, or was any of that incorporated in the training?
just, I think in any training institution, some trainers are more effective and more empathetic than others. And we had some very good ones, and we had some that were just kind of, they were there, but that's all I can say, you know.
They were just finishing out their tours and not really
Yeah, they
engaged.
were, you know, but at any rate.
But would the better ones in one way or another give you some idea of what you might be getting into?
Yes, yes.
All right. Now, at this point, were these 8-week training sessions, basic and AIT at that point?
Right.
All right. And then from there, now, do you go home after AIT, or do you go straight on to Fort Benning?
I got to go home for a week after AIT, and then I took a train up to Philadelphia, and then took a train back down to I guess we went to Atlanta and were picked up by bus in Atlanta and went down to Fort Benning.
Right. Okay. Now, explain how the OCS system worked.
There are 3 primary sources of commissions in the Army. The first is West Point. The second is ROTC. Both those, though, are 4-year programs, so it takes a while to crank people out. When the Army needs to get a lot of officers in a hurry, OCS is the answer they use. It's varied in length. When I went through it, it was a 60-month program, but it's been shorter. Now they've modified it. What they do now is it's called Branch and Material Officer Candidate Course. That got changed in the 70s, and what they do is, I went to OCS, 6-month course, graduated as a branch qualified infantry lieutenant. In other words, I was ready to go to a TNA unit. Now they do Branch and Material Officer Candidate Course, which means you graduate after 12 weeks, about 12 weeks, and then you go to the basic course that the ROTC and the West Point candidates go to, that gives you the technical part of infantry, which is normally weapon systems, small unit tactics, and that sort of thing. But the other part of OCS is they pride themselves on saying they're going to put you up under enough stress that you'll be able to deal with anything that comes along in the real world. Of course, the stuff they're doing is all manufactured crises. I mean, you know, it's that you got a shadow in your sleeve, and now you got to find a way to get new fatigues, and or you got to repaint. I don't know how many times we repainted our platoon area. It seemed to me like once a week for the first month. You know, I don't like this shade of blue. TAC officer would come along, and we would be pitching in money to buy the paint. The paint wasn't provided. We'd be pitching the money to buy the paint, and then we'd be going down buying the paint. We'd be painting the place at 2 o'clock in the morning, because we'd have this deadline. You have to have this paint in by Saturday at whatever time, and it's Thursday, and you got a full day of class tomorrow. But if we don't get part of this done tonight, no way we'll get it done tomorrow. You know. So there's a lot of manufactured crises in OCS. I look back on it with fond memories, but I damn sure don't want to do it again.
Right. Okay. Again, and what kind of guys were you training alongside? Were these mostly men out of college, or?
There were a lot of, I was the youngest guy in my OCS platoon for sure, maybe in my company. More than half of us were college ops, which means that you joined the Army at a college degree. And if you did that, that meant they would guarantee you go to OCS before you signed.
Right.
A guy like me, it's a high school graduate, I signed, I went into the Army, and then I was offered the option. There's no guarantee going in.
Right.
But the college ops were 3 or 4 years older, and I remember a lot of them weren't completely trusting the Army and weren't quite sure that what was a good deal, but they figured it'd be better to be an officer than to be a private, so they were taking that option. But at any rate, I'm definitely one of the youngest, and felt a little overwhelmed, but I did very well in OCS. I was on the commandant's list. Top 10% of the graduates are on the commandant's list. And it was a function of I was really interested, I was really engaged, and so, and it was good, because this is the first thing as an adult that I succeeded at. Before I went to college, didn't work out.
Yeah.
Then I had this job, and it didn't work out. So, and then you go through basic training and AIT, and you're just kind of a trainee.
Right.
There's, I think I was one of the 10% at the end of AIT got promoted PFC, but I mean, it didn't feel like much distinction. But I was smart. I learned what I needed to learn. And I wrote, I did well on the written test. So I was a graduate on the Commandant's list. I remember at the end of OCS, the battalion commander, who was named Bishop, Lieutenant Colonel Bishop, had all the people on the Commandant's list come into his office, into his conference room, and sit down and tell them the importance of a regular Army commission. Because when you got commissioned from OCS, normally you had a reserve commission.
Right.
But if you got a regular Army commission, if you go to West Point, you get a regular Army commission. If you go to ROTC and if you graduate in the top part, you get a regular commission. It means essentially that you have tenure, to put it in academic terms. And I remember he gave us a talk and all this type of stuff, and then went around the room, are you going to do it, are you going to do it? Most people said yes. He got to me, I said no. He said, why not? I said, I'm not old enough. You had to be 21 to apply for a regular Army commission, and I was 19. Matter of fact, I graduated in 67, yeah, I was 19. I graduated 67, 47, 20 years.
Yeah.
So it was like 3 or 4 months before my 20th birthday. So it's kind of like, oh, okay. When I got to my first unit, I was a 19-year-old, but I had a 15-year-old face. And when I got my first unit, I remember I reported, and back at that time, you didn't have, the Army has pinpoint assignments now. So before you go, you know which battalion you're going to go to. Back then, you went, you signed into the division, and the division would decide, okay, we need people here. Go to 3rd Brigade. So you go down to 3rd Brigade, and they look at their list, and they go, okay, and they decide which battalion you're going to. And I remember the 3rd Brigade headquarters was directly across the street from the 2nd of the 506, which is where I ended up. And I reported into brigade, and they said, you're going to the 2nd of the 06, somebody will be over to pick you up. Well, they sent over first lieutenant to pick me up. When you're a second lieutenant, brand new second lieutenant, a first lieutenant's God, and you're running along trying to keep up. Yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. And he takes me across the street. As we're walking in the door, the sergeant major's coming out. And the sergeant major held the door for us. Sharp salute, good morning, sir. And I'm kind of distracted, yes, sergeant major, you know. And he stopped me and said, Lieutenant, the history of the hand salute is a long and glorious one. Let's practice together. It's kind of like, oh man, how embarrassing. And then I go inside, and you report to the adjutant, the personnel officer. And I go in, sir, Lieutenant Roach reports. And he looks up and says, give me your ID card. So, sit down outside. Yes, sir. And I hear him on there, Fort Benning, Georgia, calling Fort Benning, Georgia. Did you really commission James S. Roach? Because, like I said, I had a 15-year-old face. So my first day...
Let's sort of make sure I want to kind of fill in a few more pieces here before we kind of go on to the next level. Yeah. In the OCS, in Fort Benning, I mean, how much time did you spend on things like field exercises or anything out in swamps or mountains or anything like that? Did they have parts like that? Did you do any ranger type stuff? Or?
Yes, we had tactical training as part of that. But in some ways, the tactical training was easier. I mean, there was discomfort of being outside 24 hours a day, but there was so much stuff that you needed to take care of when you're living inside. We had spit-shine floors. Why would you have a spit-shine floor? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but you had spit-shine floors, which meant when you went into your room, you couldn't walk on the floor. You stepped in, walked on the edge of the bunk bed, stepped on the desk, all of your clothes and everything in the wall locker. You had a wall locker that had to be organized for inspection, which meant that all these clothes weren't used. Maybe it didn't start that way, but that was the reality. That was the way that you worked this system. You had all the stuff in your wall locker you never used. It was set for inspection.
So where did you put the stuff you did use?
That went in your foot locker.
Okay.
And in the bottom of your foot locker was yours, but the top of the foot locker, they had a tray on the top that was also inspectable. So the wall locker and the tray of the foot locker was shit that you never used, because once you got it set up right, you didn't want to mess with it. So you lived out of the bottom of the foot locker. So there's all this other stuff going on when you're in garrison that just absorbed your time. So when you went to the field, it was actually a good deal. We didn't spend, if I could go back and change it, I would have spent more time in the field, because I think it was more appropriate to what you're actually going to do. But we spent probably no more than 15% actually out doing stuff. But
And did you and the other men training, were you expecting mostly to wind up in Vietnam at that point?
Oh, yeah,
All
yeah.
right. And how much of the actual training you got was geared to that?
Well, they had a Vietnam village, they had a few things, a very small part was actually geared to it,
Yeah.
specifically to it. But there's a whole bunch of infantry that applies directly. It doesn't matter where you're using a weapon, you have to know how to use a weapon. It doesn't matter with small unit tactics, where you're applying the tactics. Of course, tactics are a function of where you're at, so they have to be modified to the situation you're in. But it's kind of hard to duplicate South Vietnam in Georgia. And so we had a Vietnam village, and they had some stuff about spider holes, which are hidden places people pop up out of, and other things that happened to Vietnam. But of the 15% that was field, no more than I don't know, a small portion of that. I don't know how to quantify that. No more than a small portion of that was actually focused specifically in Vietnam.
Right. Okay, so you're really, to a large degree, still being just generally trained as an officer who might wind up in Germany or Korea or wherever else.
But we were in the spring of 1967. We were in the middle of the, well, I guess at the beginning of the Westmoreland buildup. So everybody in my OCS class was hoping for something else, but was pretty sure they're going to Vietnam.
Right. Okay. Now, when did you complete? You completed OCS, and when?
April 25th, 1967.
All right. And you were sent to the 101st Airborne Division.
First I went to basic training.
Right. Okay. So there's a.
Excuse me, first I went to jump school, sorry.
Okay, you go jump
Yeah.
school. All right.
When you go to jump school, by the way, if you're assigned, I was assigned to the 101st. Some people go to jump school unassigned, which means they'll run you through jump school at the end and decide where you're going to go. But most lieutenants went through jump school assigned to something. And I was assigned to the 101st, which meant you had the eagle on your shoulder. And one of the question when you went through the cadre question, when you went through jump school, is what's that on your shoulder? Well, the answer to that is Old Abe, the mascot of the 101st Wisconsin Regiment from the Civil War. They say, bullshit, that's a puking buzzard, you gotta do bullshit, push-ups. Okay, yes sir. On the other hand, if you answered it's a puking buzzard, no, it's Old Abe from the 101st Wisconsin, oh shit. Can't win for losing.
Did they do jump school at Benning or Fort Bragg?
At Benning.
Okay, so you didn't have to go to Fort Bragg anyway, so you wouldn't go to the home of the 82nd to do jump school.
No. But at any rate, yeah, the Army jump school was at Fort Benning, I think it still is.
All right, so was that a 4-week program or?
3 week.
Okay,
Ground week, tower week, jump week.
all right. And then from there, it's the 101st.
From there to 101st,
And where were they based when you joined them?
Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
Okay. And then how long did you stay then at Fort Campbell?
I got there, let me see, I graduated from OCS 25 April. I think I had a week in between before I just started jump school, so that would be like 1st of May to 20th May. I left directly from Fort Benning to go up to Campbell, overnight drive, or 2-day drive, something like that, I remember. So I joined there in late May. When I got there in late May, I described earlier my first day, and Sergeant Major, let's practice the hand salute, and you know, did this guy really get commissioned? But within 2 weeks, when I arrived at Fort Campbell, it had already been announced that the battalion that I was part of was going to go to West Point that summer to work with the summer troops, work as summer troops. And what that is every summer they run Beast Barracks, which is for brand new cadets, which is kind of like basic training. And for the second year cadets, they have a series of tactical courses that train them in small unit tactics. And they bring a battalion either from the 101st or the 82nd, it used to be. I don't know if it's still those two, but I'm sure they still bring a battalion of troops up and spend 2 or 3 months being all the support cast to make that run. So just a few weeks after I get to Fort Campbell, we launch off to West Point. I remember we get to West Point, the troops went up, I think they jumped in and we bust back, but the officers were allowed to take a POV, our car. So I had just bought like a 2-year-old Ford Galaxy or something like that And I remember I drove up, I'm originally from Philadelphia, so this was nice, because during the summer, it was only a few hour drive from West Point back then to Philadelphia, and I could go home and see family. But the very first Monday we get up there, they call us into a room, all the officers, and they do the assignments. You know, A company has responsibility for this and this and this, and B company this and this. And by the way, tomorrow morning, all of the platoon leaders will be over in Thayer Hall. Thayer Hall is the academic building, West Point, all the classrooms are. Because you're going to give we're going to break down, we have 150 firsties, guys that are about to be seniors, and we're going to bring in lieutenants and broken down into small groups, and you're going to have 15 or 20 firsties, and you're going to tell them what it's like to be a lieutenant in the TO&E unit. After the meeting, I go to my company commander and said, you know, sir, I have about a year worth of training. These guys have 3. I'm 19. They're 22. I had 3 weeks in this unit. I don't know a whole lot yet now about being, you know, the reality of being a TO&E platoon leader. Do I have to do this? He said, let me check, Lieutenant. And he came back. He said, yep, we got to fill so many classrooms. We got so many lieutenants. You got to go. Okay. So I go over there, and I still have a picture of me in my starch fatigues with a sweat line that's about big as a football. And I remember I had studied hard in OCS, and I knew the book answers, and I got questions from the cadets who were very respectful, and there's no problem with that. But after I would finish my answer, I brought my platoon sergeant, who was a big black guy named Lawrence Birch. Very good NCO. NCOs are the backbone of the Army. And there's a difference between our Army and other armies. Now that I've had 20 years experience dealing with other armies, it's our NCO Corps. But anyway, Lawrence Birch came with me. So I would give the answer, and it was a correct school answer. Lawrence Birch in the back room said, what the lieutenant means to say is, and he would fill in, you know, practical experience part, which he did very well. And those cadets listened very closely to Lawrence Birch, and so did I. But, so, I ended up kind of being a nomad, because when I arrived, I was assigned to Charlie Company. Well, we were up at West Point the entire time I was in Charlie Company as a platoon leader. About the time we were getting ready to come back from West Point, which was late August, early September, the division was notified that they were going to deploy in December. Well, so there was a shuffling, and we had a new battalion commander, and we had a series of other things happen, and I got moved from Charlie Company, because now I'm a quote-unquote experienced platoon leader, and got moved up to headquarters. And what I ended up doing, headquarters, the operations section, battalion headquarters, I was responsible for 2 or 3 different training programs that we were running, because they said, okay, you're going to go to Vietnam in 3 months, so get ready. So I didn't make up the training program. The major that was the operations officer did, but my responsibility was to execute this thing. The problem with that was the Army also announced at the same time, anyone who's been back from Vietnam for less than a year will not have to redeploy with the division. Well, about half of our NCOs had been back for less than a year. So it takes the Army, you know, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a few weeks to a month to a few months before people leave and other people come back in. So we're supposed to be running this preparation program between September and December when we're deploying. And at the same time we're doing this, we have this big personnel turbulence where the NCOs are all leaving, coming, and all this type of stuff. So that part was kind of a mess. But, so I was started in Charlie, now I'm in headquarters. We get to Vietnam, and when we arrived in Vietnam, each company had 3 rifle platoons. A platoon on paper is about 30 men. I found in the field 20 is a more likely number. They had 3 rifle platoons, but you also had a mortar platoon. Mortar men, different MOS other than Charlie. But they decided when we got to the country that it was better to have 4 rifle platoons in each company. And so they made this change, and I got sent down to Bravo Company to be the 4th platoon leader. Well, most of the guys in the platoon were 11 Charlies. They'd been trained as mortar men. And they thought themselves a step above bush, bush soldiers or, 11 bush. And suddenly they were, in their secondary MOS, they were now infantrymen on their feet, on the ground, moving out. There were a lot of unhappy people in that platoon. But, it's just luck of the draw. We'll come back and get some detail, but let me tell you about the rest of my nomad life. So I was in Bravo Company as a platoon leader from January until May or June. I'm not sure the exact date. And I was selected to be the recon platoon leader. In the battalion, there's a recon platoon. It's an echo company,
Right.
E company. And I was selected to be the recon platoon leader, which is a good thing. I mean, it tells you that the battalion commander has confidence that you can operate without a captain very close to you. So, okay. So I went, and during the summer of '68 was a very hard time. We were down in Cu Chi, took a lot of casualties. I was a recon platoon leader. At the end of the summer, we're getting ready to move north to go up to I Corps, come out of Cu Chi, go up to I Corps, and they were going to make me a company XO, which is where they would rotate people that had time. But I was very proud. This was something that I was able to do. I was proud I'd been successful, and I wanted to stay being platoon leader. So instead of being an XO, I went to A company to be a platoon leader. So Charlie, headquarters, Bravo, Echo, Alpha. So I hit all the companies except Delta. I came back from my second tour, and they made me Delta company commander. So I'm the only guy that I know that has been in all of the companies of the 2nd Battalion 506.
Right.
Just, I didn't realize it till a year or two later. I started saying, "Hey,
It's certainly an
hit 'em
unusual
all."
thing. Yeah. And okay, so it's going to go back. So do you deploy then in December? Was that when you go?
We deployed in December.
Okay. And how physically did they get your unit over to Vietnam?
We went in an airlift to C-141 Starlifters. And if you're doing long distance travel, traveling in a cargo aircraft is not a bad way to go, because normally there's places to lay down. If you're in a troop aircraft where they just pack it with soldiers, you're screwed, because you got your seat, probably not as wide as this, called a paratroop seat. It's made of nylon. You got your seat belt, but that's all you can do. You can lay down on the floor in front of you, but there's not enough room for everybody to lay down. But I was in a cargo aircraft, and we only had like 12 people in there. So, and they had all these pallets, and it was easy to find a place to lay down. A lot of those pallets were made of duffel bags, and I slept on a pallet of duffel bags all the way over. Let me tell you a story about those pallets. I was a battalion movement control officer, and what that meant was, one of my jobs, what that meant was that you had to meet with the Air Force airload planners to figure out how many aircraft were needed to move your battalion. And you were authorized, the only vehicles we took were mules, which were small kind of ATVs. ATVs before their time. They weren't very reliable. They had a lot of maintenance problems. We didn't use them much in Vietnam. But I think we took a dozen of those ATVs with us. And each company was authorized, I think, 6 pallets. A pallet is a large metal sheet that slides into the aircraft, locks down, but you build cargo on that, duffel bags, whatever else, put netting over it, and that's a quick way to load cargo in and out of the aircraft. Well, one of my responsibilities as a battalion movement control officer, after we had made all this plan and gone to several meetings, was to get the pallets weighed, because they needed to know weight and balance in the aircraft. They told us if it wasn't right, the airplane crashed and all this type of stuff. Well, the way you get that done is they had a forklift coming around that would put it on a flatbed truck. It would go down, it would weigh it, and come back, and they'd tell you that's 6,230 pounds. Well, I wasn't very organized. And what I was doing was I had a small notebook, and I would write the weight on it, but I was writing it in a felt tip pen. And I had a stapler, and I would staple this to the netting. So we got whatever the number was. We had 4 rifle companies. So there were like 25 pallets, something like that, 25, 27 pallets that we had. And they're all now in the battalion motor pool, and they all had this staple on them. Well, I come in the next morning, it rained. And the felt tip pen had all run. And on some you could kind of make out the numbers, but on some you couldn't. And there was no way that I was going to get these reweighed. I mean, it's just impossible, because they hardly had time to do it once. They didn't have time to do it twice. So I went around and said, I think this is about 5,000 pounds, you know, and my anxiety is very high because I thought, oh man, I thought that being off a few hundred pounds could create problems for the airplane and all this type of stuff. So we go down to the airfield, because I'm the battalion air movement control officer. I was the guy, chalk is an aircraft load, and we had to have like 6 chalks there on Tuesday and 8 chalks there. You know, I went down and lined everything up. And what was amazing was the C-141 would pull up, the 19-year-old loadmaster would get off and say, give me 2 of those, 1 of those, 6 of those, 7 of those, and 13 troops. And I go, what? That's not my plan. And whatever it was that we thought we were going to need, maybe 20 aircraft, whatever it was, we went significantly less. Mm-hmm. But these guys, they were 19-year-old loadmasters, but they'd done this stuff. They knew enough about what the aircraft could do and what they couldn't. I went down there with great anxiety that my 200-pound differential and the weight was going to create big problems. I found out not to sweat it. We get to Vietnam.
What route did you fly?
Excuse me?
Where did you fly out of?
We flew out of Fort Campbell.
Okay.
We stopped, I think, on the west coast, and then I think we stopped in Guam.
Okay.
Just for an hour or two to refuel.
So straight across the Pacific in this case.
Straight across the Pacific.
All right. And then where do you land in Vietnam?
We landed in Bien Hoa.
Okay.
When we got on the airplanes, there was a big deal too about we had to have ammunition on each airplane for the number of people on the airplane. And since that was shifting all the time, this was a big pain in the ass. Because the ammunition was loaded in magazines and it had to be in a sealed box. So we were breaking sealed boxes and resealing boxes and all this stuff. And I'm on this airplane with like 10 or 12 of us, not many. And an hour before we land in Vietnam, I remember we were putting on face and all this type of stuff, loading our weapons and all this stuff. Well, we landed at Bien Hoa, which is a big, huge logistics base in Vietnam, not far from Saigon.
Right.
And when it lands and the tailgate goes down, we come off tactical because we didn't know any better. And there's somebody standing there looking at me. He said, "Is that weapon loaded?" I said, "Yes, sir, it is." "God damn it, you're not allowed to load weapons inside the perimeter." It's kind of like, oh, okay. Clear your weapons, clear your weapons. You know, just kind of strange stuff. But we get to Phuoc Vinh, and most people left on a transit, on a truck convoy to go to Phuoc Vinh, which was our first base. But they had these mules. Remember the mules I told you, the only vehicles they were brought over? They had these mules, and they didn't trust these mules to run them up the road, and they didn't have enough trucks to just load them on trucks. So I was left with the young sergeant to get these mules up to Phuoc Vinh, and the way that you got them up was there was a C-7 Caribou that did a milk run every day. It was an Army twin-engine aircraft. Probably take 25, 30 people, somewhere around that size. And every day we'd do a milk run and go around and hit 4 or 5 different places. Well, they didn't have, it wasn't like you had a reservation. You would show up down at Bien Hoa at the ramp, and they would decide what they could take that day. So every day for about 4 or 5 days, I was down there with my line of mules, you know, and they wouldn't take 2 today, you know, you put them on and away they go. Well, during those 5 days, we found an M113, which is an armored personnel carrier, squad carrier, pretty big piece of equipment. And it's sitting down there, and nobody's looking at it, and after 2 or 3 days, I go over and I check it, and it runs. And I didn't have a lot of experience, but I'd driven a 113 when I was in OCS. We drove around a little bit, it all seems to work. So me and the sergeant decide, we got it. We decide, we're gonna take this with us. So we put the last of the mules on the Caribou, and the next day there was another convoy going, so we decided that we'll go with the convoy. So he found a machine gun somewhere, and mounts it on the top, and I'm up in the cupola, and he's the driver, and we fall into this thing. It's a 3 or 4 hour trip, and we get up to Phuoc Vinh, and we had never been to Phuoc Vinh. The battalion was there, but we had never been there. And since they had just arrived, the 1st Infantry Division left, we moved in. There were no signs in the area, so we drove around did 2 or 3 laps around the base before we found the battalion. And I remember we pulled into the battalion. As we pull in, my boss, because I'm still in headquarters company, who is the Major Freddie Boyd, who is the operations officer, redheaded guy, good guy, but excitable. We drive into the battalion area and he walks out and says, can I help you? I said, look what I found. He said, you can't find that. What do you mean? I said, we're not authorized to have those vehicles. You got to get rid of it. So my sergeant takes us over. What do you do? I mean, you got a 113. What do you do? My sergeant, being a good guy, a lot of initiative, let me take care of it, sir. He goes over to the local aviation unit. The aviation unit, we got mortared in Phuoc Vinh. So the barracks all had sandbags around them. The helicopters were parked in place that had revetments around them, and were all sandbagged. But moving from where they lived out to the helicopters could be dangerous. So they decided that they could use 113. So we got 6 cases of beer, 4 cases of Coke, which at that time was probably a total of like $30 worth of goods for this 113, which I'm sure the government paid a few $100,000 for or whatever. But last I knew, that 113 was at Phuoc Vinh and was still doing that. It was doing something good for the Army, so I guess that's all right, but look what I found.
All right. Now, what was the situation? So when do you actually arrive at Phuoc Vinh?
December of 1967.
Okay.
About 2 months before Big Tet.
All right. And then what then is going on then? What is your battalion doing in that time there before the Tet Offensive starts?
Well, we just arrived in country. They decided that we should have a few week or a month-long in-country training program, during which I got shot. We went down to a small bridge. It was probably 10 kilometers from Phuoc Vinh. It was a railway bridge / highway bridge. Had a rifle company around it. I'm now in Tiger Bravo. They moved me to B Company. And I'm platoon leader at Tiger Bravo. And what the company commander had us doing was training there every day, small unit tactics, and at night, 1 squad from each platoon had 3 squads, would go forward and set up an ambush. Well, after several days of this, I decided that I was bored sitting back here, and I wanted to go out with a squad ambush platoon, so I announced that I was going to go out to evaluate the squad ambush. We had a staff sergeant who was in charge of that. I can't remember his name. Much more experienced guy than I am. I'm not sure I could evaluate him, but I was going to go do that. We went out, and there was a trail along the wood lines, probably about 30 meters away. We had 2 positions forward that were looking at this kill zone, and 1 position in the rear. I was with a position in the rear. This position had a starlight scope. And back then, starlight scopes were pretty big, pretty heavy. We didn't have many. We had 1 in the platoon, and they had it. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, we tug lines. This was before you had squad radios. And the tug lines was 2 tugs means I'm awake or you awake. And you get 2 tugs back and you know they're awake. 3 tugs means I see something. So when you see something, everybody's awake and
So you actually have a wire or a cord of some kind running between the positions?
Parachute cord.
Okay. And about how far apart were your positions?
Probably 15 meters.
Okay.
Well, these guys see something. And we're watching, we're waiting, what's going on. And these 3 guys are kind of fighting over the starlight scope. Let me see. And I'm back here, but I can hear them. And that trail up there where I think bad guys are is probably not much further than I am from them. If I can hear them, they can hear them, So, oh man, this is not good. I got to do something about this. Do not sneak up on scared people. I started out hands and knees, going up toward these guys, move my rifle, moving along. I tell these guys, I'm going to go up there, we're going to go see what's happening. You guys stay here. So I start moving up here. I get to the point where I could almost reach out and touch the shoes. And one of these guys looks over his shoulder and sees somebody sneaking up on him. He takes an M79 and swings it around. M79 is a grenade launcher, 40 millimeter. Swings it around, and I hear, oh shit. And what has happened was the safety's on. He pulls the trigger, it doesn't happen. So he pushes the thumb safety, and pulls the trigger, and had a canister round in it, which is a shotgun round. Ripped my shirt, all the shit. Cut up my belt, nicked me on the side of my leg. You know, I just muzzle blast. Suddenly you can't see anything because your vision is just kind of blurred out. I roll over my back and I'm doing an inventory, and he says, "Oh shit, it's Lieutenant." So the squad leader, who's over here, who was a lot more experienced than I was, comes running over. You know, what the fuck's going on? And you know, well, said, well, we better get out of here. So we go over a few hundred meters over somewhere and squat down, and there was some mortar fire here shortly thereafter, so it's a good thing we moved. So there were bad guys, and they figured out where we were, so they shot. The next morning we go back in, which is probably a kilometer away, back into the base, but the company commander already knew something was happening because we were talking to him on the radios as it was happening. He looks at me and says, "What the fuck happened to you, Lieutenant?" Well, you know, Thump Davis shot me, but it's okay, sir. I screwed up. I snuck up on him, and I shouldn't have snuck up on him. He said, "Well, I want to see him. I want you to bring him." Sir, let me handle it. No. I want to take care of this. At that time in Vietnam, there were a lot of engagements that read, engage the enemy at 3 meters. A lot of times it was a point man, somebody walking along.
Right.
Engage somebody at 3 meters, results unknown. And what that meant was you were humping along and you're carrying that big rucksack. Here's somebody, and you do bzzz, and he probably does the same thing, and you both run, so results unknown. So before we left the base, the first sergeant warned everybody that when you can see him, when you're close, you have to aim. This is bullshit. And if anybody here engages somebody less than 3 meters and misses, I'm going to punish him. The company commander said, "You remember that?" The private's going, "Oh, yeah, sir." He says, "Well, you missed." And I'm thinking, son of a bitch. He's about to nail me because he missed. So, okay, you have a choice. You can get an Article 15, non-judicial punishment, or you can buy beer for the company. Well, naturally, he bought beer for the company. And I remember that afternoon, because he bought like 2 beers per person, but many of us didn't drink, so a lot of people had more than 2 beers. He kept coming over to me and saying, "I'm sorry I screwed up. I'm sorry I missed." It's kind of like, go away. Go away. Thump Davis. Eugene Davis. He was killed on July 22nd, which was a terrible day for Bravo Company, but he was one of the ones killed in that engagement.
All right. So this is sort of your early. So you're doing initially these are kind of training exercise things that you're doing right around Phuoc Vinh, and then after now.
It was training, but it was in a live environment.
But you were in the field.
Yes.
So, yeah.
It was training, but in a live environment. In other words, we're going to go out and do this in places where you're not likely to have a heavy contact.
Right.
You may have contact with a few, but not with a whole lot. So you can kind of slowly get broken into tactical operations.
All right. Now, were there other kind of outstanding incidents or things that happened in that time, or was it otherwise? Did you have any serious contact? I guess.
Oh yeah, we had lots of serious contacts.
But during that initial phase, when you're still.
Well, that was just a few weeks before Tet.
Right.
And we had been in operations north of Bien Hoa, and had found rice caches, which were undoubtedly for the North Vietnamese troops who were involved or planned to be involved in Tet.
Right.
We don't know if they were supposed to pick this food up on the way in or the way out, but we were moving through the jungle and we found this one pallet that had probably 15 or 20 bags, probably 30 pounds each of rice covered with green plastic. I mean, until you got right up on it, you wouldn't see it. You couldn't see it from the air. But what is this? I mean, you started looking, it's rice. Okay, put out security, because we got this. So you put the security out and they found another 2. Oh, put out security. So we found like 15 of these all in an area, all spread about 15 or 20 meters apart in the jungle. This was, I think they said at least a regiment's worth of food that they found. So we had found this, and then on the far side of this, we got into a firefight, and I don't know how many bad guys were there, but it kept us engaged for a few hours. It probably was about a platoon of bad guys.
And it was just you with your platoon at that point, or was the
No,
whole company
this
there?
company.
Okay.
And we had another company come in on top of us because they're in contact. And I remember that at that same time, that same engagement, we had a friendly fire incident in that artillery fired and hit some of our own troops. But this engagement happened like mid, or maybe the 20th or 20, somewhere late January, just maybe a week
Right.
before Tet. So we had had this, and this was our first serious contact. And we went back to Phuoc Vinh for a stand down. And I remember they had a party the night before Tet. We had a company party. I'm sure other companies have parties too. By the way, one of the things I started to tell you earlier and I forgot is a lot of people say, do you know so-and-so and such a unit? The reality of Vietnam was that you knew your rifle platoon and you knew very little more.
Right.
You were a separate universe. You might know guys in the company, but rifle platoons, you weren't allowed generally just to wander about. You were part of a tactical unit. You could talk to somebody in another squad maybe, but another platoon, that's too far away. So you were kind of a self-contained unit there. But anyway, so we had this engagement. We were back for a stand down, and they said, and I remember everybody had a good time. The next morning, I had walked down to the bunker line, which was right by our living quarters, and had sat down on a bunker and went to sleep. And I woke up like at 5 o'clock in the morning. And I go back up to where I'm living, C Hut, where I'm living. The company headquarters in the front half, and all the lieutenants lived in the back. And I walk in there, and everybody's gone. It's kind of like, what? And what had happened, yes.
We're going to pause right here because
Okay.
this tape is about out, and that's a good spot. All right, we had gotten you in your story right up just to the beginning of the Tet Offensive. And you said
Right.
you were going into was headquarters, and the officers weren't there.
Yes, we had had a party the night before. We were back on a stand down from the field, and I had gone to sleep on a bunker. Woke up at 5 in the morning and went back up to my place where I'm sleeping, the back of the company headquarters, and all the other platoon leaders are gone. It's kind of, oh my God, what happened? Well, the only place it could be is on the airstrip, because if you're going to leave Phuoc Vinh, we always left in helicopters. We left from the airstrip, so I pick up my rucksack, my rifle, and I go over to the airstrip, and sure enough, they're there, and they're all lined up. They had been called about an hour before. Nothing was happening around Phuoc Vinh, but things were happening down in Bien Hoa and Saigon and a lot of other places. And we had been called. Of course, we didn't know. All we knew, we were a reaction force, that we knew something was happening somewhere. And we were called to get ready to go. So I get there, and the company commander chews my ass out for missing movement. In the military, missing movement is a very, very bad thing. But it figures out that, it was just, I just screwed up and no big deal, and I'm still there, so it quickly went away. So we line up and we're waiting for some information on where we're going to go and what's happening, because we don't know. We just know we've been called out. I remember the company commander called us, the platoon leader's back, and he said, okay, helicopters inbound, and they're going to pick us up and move us somewhere, and we're not sure where it's at right now, but we'll probably get information when we get there. Okay. So we get into the helicopter, and we thought we were going to pick up and go to a place and get more information before we actually got into something. But when you take off in the helicopter, you lock and load your rifles. That was just kind of, we had been there a month, and we knew that's the way it worked. By the way, helicopters back then didn't have doors, didn't have seats. And if you're a platoon leader, you sat in the door with your RTO right behind you, and the preferred place was to be in the door rather than inside, because if you wanted to get out of the helicopter, that was quicker than if you're in the middle. But anyway, so we take off, and it turns out that my platoon was a point platoon, just an accident. I don't know how it happened, but it's a point platoon. I think we had a lift of 10 helicopters. Typically 5 helicopters per platoon is what you needed to carry, because they take 5 people. And we take off, and we're flying through the clouds, and we don't know where we're going. Suddenly we come down through the clouds, and we can see Bien Hoa Air Base. There's not a lot of things that we know in Vietnam, but we know Bien Hoa Air Base, because we came in through there, And I think we've been back once or twice through Bien Hoa for refueling or something like that. So we're coming down through to Bien Hoa. What we didn't know was Tet had started the night before. There were bad guys inside the wire. And we were entering an active zone. We didn't know that. And I remember telling everybody, clear your weapons, because we thought, okay, we're landing in Bien Hoa. We must be going to refuel. This is where we're going to get information.
Yeah.
And we get down to about just a second or two before we touch down, suddenly there's green tracers in the air. Green tracers were AK or RPDs, Soviet weapons. So you knew these were bad guys shooting at you. It's kind of like, holy fuck, get out of here. 5 helicopters came in short time before that happened, we could see that we were coming down to the main runway. Helicopters didn't normally land on the main runway. Helicopters landed in the grassy area off on the side. So that was strange, kind of like, why are we landing on the main runway? Suddenly there's green tracers in the air. It's kind of like, holy shit, 5 helicopters land. Everybody gets off as quick as you can, get in the ditch. 5 helicopters lift up, but 1 sets back down, and that air crew's in the ditch with us because they'd taken fire and something was broken. They couldn't fly anymore. And we were in the ditch for a few hours because some of those were RPDs. Some of those tracers were coming to RPDs a few hundred meters away, and we couldn't get to them. It took a while before somebody else was able to get to them, and then the area was clear and we were able to move. The Air Force narrowly missed a disaster that night. I mean, it was bad enough, but the disaster I'm talking about is the way the Air Force ran business was that all your weapons were locked in an arms room, kind of like in the United States, and all the troops lived in barracks. And the troops had, between each barracks, you had a ditch, essentially a bunker. It was made by digging the ditch, putting culvert over it, and putting sandbags over that. This was very good protection for mortars or rockets, which was normally the way they attacked Bien Hoa. So they had gotten used to that, and that's what they did. So when sirens went off, everybody left and went into the bunkers. It's good for indirect fire, but it's not good if somebody's inside that can just drop a grenade in there, because a grenade in a constrained space will have more effect than it would in open space. So they were very lucky because there were bad guys running around in there, but they didn't know that all those people were in the bunkers, or didn't figure that out, or didn't attack them anyway. So the Air Force had a few casualties, but they didn't have hundreds. They could have easily had hundreds.
Well, weren't the sappers probably trying to get to the aircraft?
Yes, I think that was their primary target. And they did get some aircraft, but they didn't get as many as they wanted, but they did get some because, but at any rate, so we were down there in Bien Hoa probably for another week or 10 days.
Now, when you were in the ditch, were you at least in radio contact with somebody to tell you what to do, and it was just stay put?
Well, you're in radio contact, and people were saying, where are you at? What's going on? You know, well, we've got machine gun fire coming in from this direction. I think we have 1 guy wounded, but not seriously. And you're trying to, one of your primary jobs as a platoon leader, you have more firepower available to you on the radio than your platoon has in their weapons. So the platoon is fighting with their weapons, and you're trying to get the reinforcing fires over the radio. That's a big part of your job. So whenever you get into a bad situation like that, you're on the radio talking to people, trying to see what support you can get. Air, helicopter, gunships, artillery. So that's what I was doing, but it didn't, there was a lot of stuff happening, so it wasn't like I was the only show in town.
Right.
And it took a little while before we got some reaction, and I think they got helicopter gunships and were able to direct them to the right place, and so that took care of that. But
Now, after that, then you come out, you finally get out of the ditch, and then what do you wind up doing?
well, there was a little village down off the end of the runway. Bien Hoa, I think, was actually a small place. It wasn't like it was a big city. Bien Hoa base was a big city. But Bien Hoa, the Vietnamese village, was a small place, and the bad guys were inside the wire, some of them, but a whole bunch of them were down in Bien Hoa village. So we went down and did street to street in Bien Hoa village for a few days. We were with the 11th Armored Cav down there, the Black Horse, which is the name of their nickname, the Black Horse.
Right.
Very impressive fighting unit. They have M13s that have a 50 caliber, which is common. But then they had two M60 machine guns mounted kind of on the front corners of the cargo hatch. Top of the vehicle has a cargo hatch, and they had M60s there. And when you got 4 or 5 of those online, they could just cut down vegetation, buildings, whatever else was in front of them. They cut it down. But if you're in a vehicle like that, also it makes you very vulnerable because you're very easy to be seen. And I remember we had a few of the crew chiefs shot out of the cupola or killed in the cupola because they're up there and they can be seen. And but that was when you're in a and this is a village, very small houses, very small alleyways, very small streets. There's a lot of places to hide. It was just a very tough 2 or 3 days. We lost, I don't know how many we lost. We probably lost 10 out of the company. One of the things that was disappointing about, and I guess it just shows you the human side of this, about Tet, is that when we got back, it must have been like 3 weeks later to Phuoc Vinh, there was something waiting for me from Division, which said you need to write up the citation for a Silver Star for PFC Joe Schmo. Can't remember his name, but and PFC Joe Schmo was a schmo. He was a guy that was always in trouble, and he was just always goofing off and messing around. And what had happened during Tet, he walked up to one of his buddies who carried an M79, that short round, and this was also a canister round, a shotgun round. He grabs the end of the M79 and just got, hey, how you doing? Well, the M79 went off. And he shot himself in the chest. Essentially, he shot himself in the chest. Didn't mean to do that, but it went off, hit him in the chest. We put him on a helicopter, a medevac bird, and the medic said he didn't know if he was going to make it or not, and we had a very good medic because he had been an EMT before there were EMTs. He had been an ambulance guy before he joined the Army. So he said he didn't know if he was going to make it or not. He goes to the hospital. They operate on open heart surgery. They take a pellet out of his heart muscle, but he survives. He wakes up in the hospital several days later, and the division commander, who's named Barsante, is walking down handing out awards for Tet. And he walks up, were you wounded in Tet? And this young man, I guess, said, yeah, yes, sir, I was. And he pins a Silver Star on him. And so I get this letter down, write up the citation of the Silver Star of PFC Joe Schmo. Well, I'm enraged, and I go to the company commander, oh, this is right, blah, blah, blah. He says, Lieutenant, calm down, this will be fixed. All you need to do is write out what happened, and it'll go back up through the system, they'll revoke the Silver Star. So being a wise ass, I wrote a citation, and I wrote the citation, PFC Joe Schmo shot himself in the left chest with no regard for his own life, thereby bringing great credit upon himself, his unit, in the United States Army. And this goes back up, and I guess nobody reads it. And it gets up to brigade, and they read it at brigade, and I get summoned, me, the company commander, and the battalion commander get summoned to report to the brigade commander, what are you doing? What is this bullshit? And sir, the big thing the brigade commander talked about, his name was Mallory, was professionalism. You have to do the right thing for the right reasons. And I tried to say, sir, I'm just trying to be professional and tell people what actually happened. And I got run out of the room, and then he talked to the company commander and battalion commander, I guess. But at any rate, awards mean something, but awards are a very human type of thing, and a lot of times people do stuff they should get awards for, they don't get it for. And people get awards for stuff that is just kind of, they're tourists. They're wandering through the area. But anyway.
When you were going through the village, were the civilians there or had they disappeared?
They disappeared.
Okay.
The guys that we were dealing with down there around Bien Hoa, and then we dealt with over in Cu Chi, were all North Vietnamese that had been brought in for Tet.
Right.
And so there were Viet Cong, but we weren't engaging Viet Cong at that time. a word on casualties. It's interesting, the Infantry Rifle Company at that time was supposed to be Table of Organization and Equipment, TO&E, was supposed to be, I think, 160 something. The reality in the field was you rarely had more than 100. Because in addition to combat wounding and all that type of stuff, you're doing heavy physical things and people get hurt. And people sometimes get hurt bad enough that they get evacuated and never see them again. But people sometimes get hurt and they need 2 weeks off and they go back and then they come back. So you rarely saw more than 100 people in the field. It was not uncommon to be down to 60 in a rifle company. There's only one company that I've seen that's done this, and it's Tiger Bravo Company for 1968, has listed all of the killed in actions in Tiger Bravo. And if you do a Google search for Tiger Bravo, you'll find the page. They've got 32 KIs listed for that year, for 1968. The ratio of wounded to killed was 5 to 1 if you counted all wounds, was 3 to 1 if you counted evacuated wounds, people that were wounded and evacuated. So just start with the evacuated wounds. If you had 30 killed, 3 times 30 is 90. 90 and 30 is 120 on a base of 100. Your chances of surviving a year in the field with a rifle company were not good. We did not like, and the reality of being a platoon leader or a squad leader or a medic was that when shit was happening, it was your job to try to go sort it out. And I know several instances where, and I've had people ask me this question, how the platoon leader is killed and 2 squad leaders and 2 sergeants, how did all that happen? Well, those are the problem solvers. And when some shit's happening, they're trying to go to where the problem's at and trying to solve that problem, see what's going on. Medics also are guys that are going to go where bad shit's happening and try to solve it. But it was the summer of 1968 was very hard, and I don't know exact numbers, but I would say probably 2/3 of our casualties came in that summer in Cu Chi. And that was still fighting against the remnants of the guys that came in for Tet. But now they're trapped. I mean, we had a rough summer, but they had a rougher summer.
Right. Because their whole plan had essentially unraveled. They were going to go win the war, and they'd sent all the units down there, and there wasn't really a plan B.
Correct. And tactically, they lost.
Yeah.
But what happened is that a lot of the media perceived this as a defeat because a lot of the media had been in Saigon and had never seen a war up close and personal, but now they saw it up close and personal. And so, and they were distressed by that. And war up close and personal is distressing. Yeah. I don't take that from them. But what it caused was, it caused a shift in American perception of, is this worth it or not? So that was a turning point in the war. It was a surprise turning point for the North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese said, we're getting our ass handed to us, and suddenly the U.S. press is saying that they're being beaten, pulled us out of the fire. But we believe that life is sacred, individual life is sacred. That is not the common perspective around the world. It certainly was not the common perspective in Vietnam. And the vast majority of, I think it was some amazing number, we lost 50,000. I think the South Vietnamese in the war, was it 2 million? I think 2 million. But the North Vietnamese lost 800,000, something like that, some incredible number. I may be off, but it was an incredibly high number. And if you look at it in traditional military parlance, you say, well, these guys must have won.
Right.
But there's more to war than just battles, and part of it is the ability to explain to people why something's important and why you're willing to sacrifice for it. And in retrospect, it's interesting. At that time, I had about a year ago, I had some young college students come do oral history with me. And I was surprised by some of their questions. They were good kids. They were trying to do a good job, nothing against what they're doing, but it's just a function of you don't realize your experience is unique until you hear somebody else talking about the same thing. Say, no, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And one of the things that they carried with them was just kind of in the background, that all war is bad and we should avoid all war. Okay. But when I look back on that, I say, you know, it's interesting, at the time, there were two narratives going on. One narrative was that this is the defense of Western democracy and all young men need to be engaged and need to support their government. And those of us who are in the military may have not been enthusiastic about it, but we thought that that was our duty,
Right.
and we did it. The other narrative was that communism is not a bad system and might even be more appropriate for a poor agricultural country like Vietnam. Well, in the 90s, a series of books, two books specifically were written. One was called Death by Government. Rummels, I think, was the name of the author. And the other was a Black Book of Communism that was published by a series of Europeans and socialists. And both of those document the level of genocide that happened within Russia, China, and other countries. And they make Hitler and 6 million Jews look like small league. It's hard to get specific numbers, but they estimate at least 100 million between Russia and China killing their own citizens. By the way, citizens is a term that we use that we think is used everywhere. It's not. Citizen is something that comes from Western culture, and a lot of places didn't understand that, didn't even understand the concept. What's a citizen? You know, they understand you're a peon, you understand that, but you know, citizen, they don't get it. And I think, looking back, I think that I was on the right side of history. Not that I was smart enough to figure out history at that time and to say that this is a good thing to do. I was going on my confidence in national leaders that they were doing the right thing.
And ultimately, as a soldier, that is your job.
Yes. When I hear Bill Clinton talking about he evaluated all this as a 19 or 20-year-old, I just say that's so much bullshit. It's just like people, and younger people will be influenced by this. When Dan Quayle was picked to be the vice presidential running mate for Bush, the older Bush, I remember one of the things was he had been in the National Guard during Vietnam. And he said, I joined the National Guard to go to Vietnam. Well, for somebody that wasn't around at that time, okay, maybe they believe it. But for somebody who was there, you know, that's bullshit. Now, if you tell me I joined the National Guard because that was an acceptable alternative, I got it, won't argue with you, that's fine. But when you say I joined the National Guard to go to Vietnam, you say that's bullshit. That's absolute bullshit. Because everybody knew that was the way not to go to Vietnam. Could have changed with a political decision, but it didn't.
Yeah, and it was, you know, that getting us kind of off the track a little bit there, but you know, yeah, I mean, that's part of the bigger context. I mean, I want to kind of sort of get back into your world here again.
Yeah.
The Tet Offensive has started. You're at Bien Hoa now. Do you move pretty quickly from Bien Hoa back to the Cu Chi area, or do you go back to Phuoc Vinh? What happens in the next few months?
We stayed down in Bien Hoa for at least 10 days, 2 weeks, and then we moved a little bit, and I think we had a rotation back, a stand down back in Phuoc Vinh, but then we were back and we slowly moved over. Most of the division moved north because the 101st Division was in Camp Eagle, which is up north away.
Right.
And the 3rd Brigade had been down south. The 3rd Brigade that year was used as a fire brigade for USRV. And what that meant was when USRV thought they needed additional troops somewhere, you got moved there. So we moved first, we were moving down around Bien Hoa, then we moved up into the Central Highlands up by Dak To. And we spent a month or so there, and we had 1 or 2 sharp engagements, but then we didn't have any engagements. It's kind of like they tested us and said, we'll wait for somebody else. And then they backed off and they just went away. We were very close to the border up there. From Dak To, we got moved back down to Cu Chi, and we're actually under the operational control of the 25th Infantry Division. Cu Chi was a place with a lot of booby traps, and we lost a lot of people, and walking around in a place with booby traps makes you paranoid. You know, it's kind of scary. But at any rate, that was the reality. My reality of combat, anyway, was when you watch movies or TV, there's always something where you can react, where you see something and where you can react and you can do stuff. A lot of times, in my experience in combat, that isn't the norm. A lot of times, shit happens and it's done before you can react, before you even knew that it was happening. You're walking down the trail and there's an explosion, it's 155, and it was buried and was tripwired, and you got 3 or 4 people dead, and you got 5 or 6 people that are horribly wounded, and you're reacting to the situation, trying to secure the area, but moving slowly because you don't know there's other booby traps around, and trying to find the close LC so you can evacuate your wounded. But a lot more of the things that where I saw people lost were those type of things where it was past the point of reacting. I mean, to the enemy. It was now reacting to take care of the people that were hurt.
Would they also spring an ambush and then vanish, so you might lose a couple of men and then they're gone? Or
That could have happened, but my experience was more likely that a lot of things that we called ambushes were people called ambushes, were situations where somebody was in the jungle, and they were dug into some place because this is a place that was protected, and they were protected from air. And if you were walking by, they was just as likely want you to just walk by, don't mess with us. But if you came too close and they're afraid they were going to be seen, or afraid they were seen, they were going to engage you with fire. So it was more defensive fire, because once they were in a position, and once you were able to pin them down, you could kill them. That was a reality, because it wasn't, we had good soldiers. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about we had so much firepower and call that if you could find them, you could pin them, you could kill them.
Right.
That was the reality. So they didn't want to be in contact with you, you know, because they knew that, you know, we may get 1 or 2 of these assholes, but they're going to get us. So things that some people called ambushes, a lot of times to me, didn't seem like they were ambushes. They were defensive. They were in a defensive position, praying you were going to go by and not see them. And sometimes you did, and an engagement ensued, and they were killed.
okay. Now the Cu Chi area is also noticed for having an awful lot of tunnels and other kinds of
Yes.
prepared positions.
Yes.
Were you having to deal with that while you're patrolling?
Yes. And by the way, I went in a tunnel one time with the 357 and fired it, and that's probably part of the reason I'm deaf today. If you're going to use something in a closed space, do not use a large caliber pistol. And what I shot at, I think, was a rat. I don't know what it was. It was something moving rapidly, and boom! It was kind of like your head inside of a can. Boom! But I was goofy. If anybody was there, they could have taken me out with a fingernail file for the next few minutes. But Cu Chi was a place with a lot of tunnels, and they had there was supposedly some type of relationship in Cu Chi between Ho Chi Minh and Cu Chi. Some relationship. He had been there. I don't know if he'd been there, born there, something like that. But go into a village and you would see all the women had these red flag pins on. There were no military-age men. There were women and children. And you knew that their husbands were probably VC, and they were probably out somewhere. But and when you found a village and you looked in the village and you found out that they had more than a bag or 2 of rice in their hut, a bag or 2 was a reasonable expectation. 30 or 40 pounds of rice, that was a reasonable expectation. But you went in, you found 10 big bags of rice. Well, you knew this was probably part of somebody's food supply, because they didn't have enough money to have that. So we tried to evacuate that type of food, that type of rice, and I think it was supposed to go into channels where it would be distributed through the government to Vietnamese civilians, because we were trying to bring them into controlled areas. But
What sort of interaction do you have with the Vietnamese civilians then if you're going through villages and things like that? How do you deal with each other?
Mostly the Vietnamese civilians that I saw were afraid of anybody with a gun. DC were Americans, just kind of like, whoa, leave us alone. It worked much better if you had a Chu Hoi with you, a Vietnamese who could converse with them. But it doesn't matter where you are. If you leave American troops by poor third world people for more than 24 hours, they'll start making plans on how to help.
Yeah.
One of the Marine Corps backed into a very good system. It was documented in The Village by, I'm trying to remember the author's name, but what had happened was at Da Nang Air Base, they wanted to establish an external ring of security. So they came up with this idea that they put a squad of Marines in each village and they would form a platoon, one squad of Marines and several Vietnamese, or 2 or 3 squads of Vietnamese. That was the military aspect. What they didn't count on, and what was the key to success in this, is those young Americans, you put them out in these villages, they started to make their plans for how they're going to help that village. Sometimes that involved midnight requisitions of cement and other stuff from the base, but that's okay. I think it was a great investment because nobody had done anything for those poor Vietnamese peasants until these young Marines came along. And maybe they built the bridge, or maybe they fixed the school, maybe, and the medic who was just, you know, maybe an 8-week Band-Aid, not much, but he had some pills. And just the fact somebody's paying attention, trying to help them, was the thing that made that a viable program. That was something completely outside the realm of the military, unintended consequence, very positive one. But wherever I've seen soldiers stationary beside Vietnamese or other third world people, that's the reason today why U.S. can go back to Vietnam, and they encourage military veterans or Vietnam War veterans to come back, but you will not see that happen in Afghanistan because different culture, different treatment, and you just won't see that in Afghanistan.
It does, to an extent, parallel the surge strategy in Iraq, where they were putting men in small units in the communities and making connections and working with them and that kind of thing. And to actually was modeled after the Vietnam experience in part, but at least that was Trey's approach. But still, it's the kind of thing sort of initially just sort of improvised on the ground and by the Marines, and not part of a system that you were in.
You know, a lot of very good stuff has come from the bottom up. The idea of dog tags, Civil War. A lot of soldiers knew that if they went into a battle and if they were killed, nobody would ever know. So they started putting pieces of paper on the back of their shirt, you know, and said, I'm John Doe and I'm from here, so that somebody would notify his family. So a lot of ideas start from the bottom up. A common thing we do today, and we did in Vietnam, was when you had a fallen soldier, you were going to have a ceremony, you would have a rifle with a helmet on top of it. Do you know how that started? First World War. When they had the mass attacks, the mass attack would go out, and then after things stabilized a little bit, the medics would go out, and the medics would treat the wounded, but this was a moonscape. They would go out and they'd find a lot of these people down in ditches. Well, some weren't dead. Well, if you're dead, you don't need your helmet. So they take the rifle to mark the place, they put the helmet on top, and that meant that this guy's dead, because the next guy's coming on stretcher bearers. If somebody's wounded, they just stick the rifle in, but no helmet. He's still alive, he can use the helmet. So the stretcher bearers, it was a bottom-driven system for the stretcher bearers to figure out who to get first. You get the guys that are still alive, the dead can wait. So a lot of the stuff, good stuff, really comes from the bottom up.
All right. Let's pull it back. So you're operating the Cu Chi area, and now, were you still just a platoon leader in Bravo, or had you changed your job again?
I was a platoon leader in Bravo until about June when we went to Cu Chi, and I was a recon platoon leader then. The recon platoon is a platoon and echo company that's used by the battalion staff. By doctrine, it's supposed to be the element that can go check things out and figure out what's going on, not the primary fighting unit. It can be employed as a platoon or a series of squads. And we operated that way when I was down in, when we were down in Cu Chi, we were separate. So there were some big fights that we weren't involved in because the rifle companies were in those. And once the fight started, they pulled us back and you send you somewhere else to try to figure out, we got this going on here, what's going to happen next, where do you go? But, let me tell you a little bit more about infantry soldiers in the field. In the very first part, there was some of the CDs I was looking at last night had pictures of Gary Radford with a Ranger tab and a 101st patch on, and I commented to my wife, that's not a normal field uniform. A normal field uniform didn't have anything on it. And it didn't start out that way, and I don't know when we made the transition, because therefore the first month or two we'd go back once every month to Phuoc Vinh, and you had clothes there and whatever, and you'd wear the clothes you had on for a month or two, and you'd come back and you change them. Well, we got to the point probably about Cu Chi where we didn't go back to base camps. And about once a month you would go to a quartermaster bath unit. There'd be a tent set up that had shower heads inside. You'd walk up to the tent, and on one side, the entrance side, you'd take off your uniform. People had t-shirts, you didn't have any underpants, and you had socks. You'd take off your clothes and you'd throw them in the pile. They would be washed and reissued a few days later. You'd go in and you'd take a shower, which was wonderful, because they often had hot water. That was wonderful. You come out the other side and there'd be fatigues there that were used fatigues that had been turned in a week or two earlier and washed, in some cases mended, and you'd put these on. So there was no name tag, no U.S. Army, no 101st patch, none of that stuff. Toward the end of my first tour, when I was in Alpha Company, I remember we went to Pole Bridge, which was on Route 547, which went from the coastal plain into the Asheville Valley. And when we got there, we thought we were in heaven, because if you're a grunt, you're sleeping on the ground all the time. And this had a small perimeter on each side of the bridge. I think we had three bunkers on one side, 4 on the other. And these bunkers were big bunkers. They were walk-in bunkers, and they had 2 bunk beds, so room for 4 guys. Didn't have mattresses, just had springs. And they weren't coil springs, they were just a flat type of thing. That was better than sleeping on the ground. So we thought we were in hog heaven, you know, because we used to being field soldiers. But about 10 days to 2 weeks after we got there, it started to rain. It's rainy season. And we're down on the plain and along the river plain, and there's a lot of agriculture down there, and they use water buffaloes, and I think that's a primary source of their manure and all that kind of stuff. So it starts to rain, and the water comes up because the river is rising, and now you're suddenly ankle deep in water. And all this stuff's floating down amongst you, and I think we started out with 26 people. By the end of the week, we're down to 15, 16, because people got sick. I mean, you get violently sick.
Yeah.
Then one night in the middle of the night, still raining, and all the bunkers collapsed, because these bunkers didn't have internal support. They were sandbags, double sandbags, PSP on top, 2 layers of sandbags on the top. But that's a lot of weight on the top. And it rained, and it got heavier, and the sandbag slipped. We had one guy that we dug out that had a broken arm, but it was good that we were all digging him out, because the other ones collapsed too. And if other people were in them, they would have probably been hurt. But so this turned from a wonderful experience to a terrible experience, because suddenly now the only thing that is out of the water is the berm between the bunkers. And that's muddy. I mean, you know, this is a miserable existence. We survived that for a week or two, and then the rain stopped. And after about 4 or 5 days, the water had gone down, and we're once again probably in ankle-deep mud, some dry places, but generally ankle-deep mud. And we get a visitor. I should have probably evacuated myself, but I didn't. I remember I'm sitting in a latrine, a 2-hole latrine, and I have a bad case of diarrhea, and I'm puking, and somebody says, "Hey, Lieutenant, there's somebody out here to see you." Kind of, oh shit, who's this? You know, you normally don't get any visitors. And most visitors come by helicopter. I didn't hear a helicopter, so who's this? Well, new brigade commander, who was named Comney, who was a Second World War veteran, was probably a good man. This story doesn't put him in good light, but he's probably a good man. He just didn't understand what he's looking at. He had come down from the fire base. He was new in the brigade. He was visiting fire bases. At the fire base, it's like 5 kilometers up the road. they have a Jeep. He decides he's gonna come down and see what's going on at the pole bridge. He comes driving down. Well, he has on a stateside uniform in that, I mean, everything's sewn on. Name tag, US Army, patches, all this good stuff, rank, shiny shoes, starch, or at least pressed fatigues. And he comes down and he wants to see who's in charge. I'm in charge. So I go over there and report to him. And the first thing he says, Lieutenant, are you a fucking lieutenant? Where is your fucking uniform? You know, what do you say? I mean, this has been my reality for the last 6 months. What do you mean, where's my uniform? You know, there's nothing to say back, so you just stand there. Well, he chewed me out and chewed me out. And sir, excuse me. God damn it, Lieutenant, I'm not done. Sir, excuse me. God damn it, Lieutenant, can't you hear? What was that? Sir, I just shit my pants. Gets in his Jeep and drives off. Well, the only pair of pants I got are the pair of pants I got on that have shit in them. Not much shit, really, mostly water. So I take them off. I mean, you're not going to walk around with this. You take them off, you go down the river, and you wash them out. All the soldiers are laughing, you know, and the mama sons on the other side of the river are laughing. Just life, what can you do? I go back up and call my company commander on the radio and said, I think I'm in big trouble. He said, why is that? So, well, brigade commander, I guess, came and chewed me out for my uniform and I shit my pants. He says, I'll take care of it. So nothing ever happened, but another story that happened, kind of the same thing. I think Comedy got educated. While we were in Cu Chi, I remember we went in to see some people in the medevac hospital that were there. Me and my company commander. My company commander at that time was Freddie Rankin, and he had a shirt that he carried with him, a fatigue shirt, that had captain's bars, name tags, all that stuff. So we go into the hospital and we see the soldiers that are wounded. And on the way out, we decided to stop in the officers' club and to get a drink. Well, there's a lot of young nurses in the officers' club, very attractive young ladies. I'm sure they were very attractive in their own right, but they're even more attractive because I haven't seen a young lady in about 6 months. So it was just kind of like, wow, just let me stand around and watch this, you know. Well, a lieutenant colonel, a female lieutenant colonel, who's probably a senior nurse or something, comes over and tells me, I'm sorry, we don't allow drivers in the officers' club. And I said, ma'am, I'm not the driver, I'm a lieutenant in the United States Army. Here's my ID card. She says, well, what's wrong with your uniform? You know, and I'm kind of going, I was only living like 20 kilometers from her. I mean, and I'm very glad we had the hospital there and did wonderful things, not to degrade it, but she just didn't understand that.
Right.
And one of the things she said was, you're sending people in here that are all money, they're wounded in their money. It's kind of like, yeah. You shouldn't let them get money. Huh? There were distinct universes, even in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And people understood their universe. But it's very easy not to know what's going on 20 kilometers away. And I was in the infantry universe, and I understood that. And thank God we had the nurses there and all that type of stuff. But a lot of them just didn't understand the universe that we lived in. But
we got to roll back into sort of your own personal narrative here.
Yeah.
Let's take us through the sequence. You're in the Cu Chi area from when to when, roughly?
we're in the Cu Chi area from probably early June till late August. And then they decided that we were going to be sent back up to become part of the 101st, or under the control of the 101st.
Right.
And I remember we made the move into C-123. You know, when we are moving in aircraft today, used to the idea that you have a seat, because the seat is not only a comfortable place, but it's also a protected place. If anything bad happens to the airplane, they're made to collapse and absorb a lot of the impact, and so you're more likely to survive. But the way we moved troops in Vietnam is we moved a company in C-123, and we probably had 6 people across the back, sat down, and then other people come up and sit down between your legs. And so we had 150 people in we have more than a company, because the company's 100, 120. We had like 150 people in this C-123. Seatbelts? No seatbelts. The only thing that's holding you down is you're kind of part of a mat of human flesh on the bottom of the seat. But they moved us up to Camp Evans. And when we arrived at Camp Evans, the 1st Infantry Division was leaving Camp Evans to go to Phuoc Vinh, where we had left. And we were moving into Camp Evans, where they had been. And naturally, they called us...
1st Infantry or 1st Cav?
1st Cav Division. 1st Infantry moved out of Phuoc Vinh when we moved in, Big Red One.
Yeah.
So toward the end of the year, we moved up to Camp Evans, up in I Corps, and the 1st Cav left, and they went down to Phuoc Vinh. But 19, 20-year-olds are rambunctious like this, but we would tell them, that's a horse you never rode, over the line you never crossed, and the color is the reason why. And they would call us puking buzzards, and and some pushing and shoving ensued, but it was just kind of part of the reality of life. One of the first missions we had when we got up to the northern part of the country was I think it was the 1st Marine Division. It was the Marine Division that was the furthest north tactical unit. I think it was the 1st Marine Division. There's only one Marine Division there. Was being withdrawn. And we were sent up there, and we were to be there to provide the security while they left. And when we were down south, there were some hills, but it was generally open flat land, a lot of rice paddies, all that type of stuff. Well, I Corps, we were in the mountains, and it gets cold in the mountains, and as a young man, well, as a man now, the idea of cuddling with another guy is not something that is attractive. But when it's cold, I've been in people piles of 3 or 4 guys all spooned together with people arguing about it's my turn to be in the middle. Because that's where the warmth is. So let me in the middle. It's my turn to be in the middle. But so the last few months we didn't take nearly as many casualties. That summer we also had an infusion program. And what the infusion program was about, since the division came together in December of '67, they were worried about December '68 there would be a large turnover.
Right.
So we have to infuse people, bring some people out, bring other people in, so that we'll not have that big bump. Turns out that we had enough casualties in the 2nd and the 506 that wouldn't have been a problem, but at the end of the year when I left Alpha Company, only 2 people left Alpha Company. Me and 1 sergeant were the only 2 guys that arrived a year later with 101st. Everybody else, between infusions and whatever else, had gone.
Right.
There were 16 rifle platoon leaders, because there were 4 companies, 4 rifle platoons each. 8 were killed in action. I don't know how many were evacuated, but I was the only guy that finished 1 year on the line in 2nd of the 506th. If I could go back, I would have convinced myself not to spend the whole year on the line, because I was offered the opportunity to be an XO. But at the time I was very proud that I could do it, and I was doing it well, and I just wanted to keep doing it, so I kept doing it.
Yeah, and you had sort of changed assignments a couple of times already, so the standard seemed to have been, for those who make it through years, you do 6 months in one position and 6 in another.
Yeah.
And normally 6 months in the field and 6 maybe in the rear or whatever. But and at times there was leeway, especially if they needed men in the field.
Yes.
So you were in a position where the people above... Now, did the people above you in the chain of command stay the same, or were they getting rotated out too?
They get rotated. Battalion commander, well, normally it was 6 months as a company commander, or 6 months also, maybe a little longer as a battalion commander. But you didn't have much contact with battalion commander as a company commander. I was just talking to somebody yesterday that was a good guy, and he was a rifle platoon leader, RTO. And he was saying, somebody asked him, the guy that he was the RTO for asked him if he knew this captain, that captain, all that stuff. He said, I didn't know those guys. We all work in networks. And if you're in a rifle platoon, your universe is that rifle platoon. You don't know very many people outside that rifle platoon. That's just the reality of life. Even today, we work in networks. I have a work network, I have a family network, as you do too, and you work in those networks, And just because you're in Springfield, Missouri, doesn't mean you know everybody in Springfield, Missouri, or in Oxford, Pennsylvania, you know. Depends on what networks you're in.
And in Vietnam, you operated small units so much that that really becomes that universe.
There
What kind of missions were you running when you were up in I Corps? What were you doing those last months?
In I Corps, we pretty much operated company level. Down in Cu Chi, we're operating company level, but also platoon level. A lot of times when you say platoon level, what you're doing is you're looking for the bad guys, so you're broken up into platoons.
Right.
But the idea is the platoons won't be so far apart that they can't reinforce one another if somebody gets in trouble. But up in I Corps, we're pretty much all in company units.
Was there an expectation that you might encounter larger forces and so you need to stay together, or just a different kind of mission you were running?
I can't tell you on what basis the decision was made,
Okay.
because I don't know. I think they were worried because we're pretty close to the DMC that there could be heavy forces in the area, and that's probably the reason they kept us in company formations. But once you're on the bottom of the hill, it's awful hard to get to the top. Geology presents some really big challenges, and especially if you just got one or two guys up there with rifles or hand grenades, they can definitely screw with you. So if you're moving as a company, you have a little more flexibility and you have a little more oomph as you run into something. So, of course, the problem is in very restricted terrain, a lot of times you're in a file. And a file's not very good to react to contact front.
Right.
Because once contact's had, once bullets are, everybody's in the stomach. And then moving people up to get to the point where you got is tough. But still, we stayed in companies. We didn't have nearly as many casualties in the last 3 months as we had in the summer. The summer was a hard time. So.
All right. Now, while you're in areas that have a lot of civilians in them, or you're on large bases for certain chunks of time, did you have sort of morale or discipline issues come up, either in terms of people dealing with the civilians or other women or bars or drugs or things like that? Did you run into that, or was the morale and discipline tight enough that that didn't get in your way?
When we were down south, we had much more exposure to civilians than we did up north. And I remember there were a few houses of prostitution down south. There were some up north. I remember we had a company XO who was a good guy that had to go down to Camp Eagle, which is like, I think, a 2 or 3 hour drive from Camp Evans. While he was at Camp Eagle, he was in a house of ill repute, and the MPs busted the house, and he ended up with a report on him. And I remember the battalion commander was a good guy, was killed, but saying that he was going to court-martial him for utter stupidity or something like that. He made up an article. I think it was Article 134. There's only 133 in the UCMJ. 134 for gross stupidity. But there was some prostitution, I know, there. But when we got up north, our base was right near Phuoc Vinh. Phuoc Vinh was the name of the local district headquarters. It was right outside of there. And in Phuoc Vinh, there were some houses of ill repute. And Phuoc Vinh was interesting because I remember talking to the district chief that spoke pretty good English, because for some reason I spent a day with him. And I remember him telling me, this was kind of a shock to me at the time, that he paid $10,000 to be a district chief. And $10,000 in 1968 was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like, you what? Because I'm in the Army, and probably in the idealistic Army mindset of you do the duty you're given the best of your ability and paid for your position. And he said, yes, you'd be a fool not to make it back in 6 months. It's kind of like, what? But there were all types of scams going on. there was a big relocation project happening in that district, and there was a lot of money coming through USAID and other places, and I don't know exactly how it worked, but I know he was getting some of that money. But when people are dirt poor, and suddenly they see money going by, it's hard for them not to grab it. And I don't think he was unique, but
No.
but that was kind of shocking for me as a young officer to find out, holy mackerel. But
Okay. Had drugs become an issue by then, or was that not something you had to
drugs were an issue, marijuana was the primary issue. I had somebody that we got picked up one day. We didn't expect to get picked up. It turns out this soldier was out on security position, which is an especially bad place to do this type of thing. But he was smoking marijuana, and he was kind of goofy, and I didn't know that. But what happened was they picked up a helicopter, took us someplace, and he stepped out of the helicopter like 300 feet.
Oh.
And only after he stepped out of the helicopter 300 feet did I find out afterwards that he had been smoking marijuana. He was kind of goofy. His squad leader thought, it'll be okay. We'll just put him in the helicopter. We'll get to the new place. It'll be all right. But there's no safety belt. You're sitting in the door. You got to hold on. If you do something stupid, you can kill yourself, and he did. And it's sad, but if there was a good outcome of that was that I think that cut back marijuana use in my platoon anyway. I knew there were some people using marijuana, but it's a matter, you try to tell them if you get caught, you're going to get punished. Don't do it. But I had the feeling that people were using it, but after that was an Alpha company, and I was only there for another few months, but during the other few months I was there, I got the feeling that marijuana use went way, way down. So.
And was it normally something in the rear rather than in the field, or?
There was a lot of problems with it in the rear, but I didn't spend much time in the rear, but I know we had a lot of problems in the rear with it.
Okay. From a different angle, how would you characterize morale in the battalion for the year you're with it?
It was a dramatic difference from the time we arrived to the time we left. The time we arrived, we were kind of gung-ho. We had NCOs, E7s were guys like 12, 15 years service as platoon sergeants. E6s had at least 4 or 5 years as squad leaders. Then E5s, that's normal T1E organization. By that summer, I was running a platoon with a Spec 4 who had less time in service than I did as a platoon sergeant. And the squad leaders were just, other young privates that seemed to have their stuff together a little bit better than their compatriots, and you pick the best ones, and you're the squad leader. It was very good that the Army came up what they called the Shake and Bake program, which was non-commissioned officer education system, which was essentially OCS for NCOs. And what they did was I guess they were having a tremendous problem keeping NCOs in line because as you get older, it's easier to twist your knee, back, whatever. And a lot of the more senior guys got hurt, and not just wounded, but I mean, if you're carrying heavy rucksack and you're going up and down hills and all this type of stuff, you trip, you fall, bam, 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 you get banged up, you need to go to the rear. They find a different job in the rear and you never see them again. So we ended up with green lieutenants and young soldiers making the best with what they had. So it was a lot better to have somebody that had additional 12 weeks of training and some orientation on you're going to be the boss, so this is the things you got to worry about, than just starting with somebody who'd been through basic and AIT. So the NCOS program was very good. But
it still doesn't fully replace all that experience.
No, it doesn't. It's nice to have somebody around with 10, 12 years experience when you're a brand new guy. And that was just a gap.
All right. Now, how does your first tour kind of wind up? Or?
I completed a year on the line. I left Vietnam, I think, on December 2nd, 3rd, 4th, somewhere around there. I arrived, I think, on the 7th, the year before. I remember from the very first platoon I was in Charlie Company, in the summer of '67, so 18 months later, December '68, I had a Malay who was a big Samoan, who was very strong and a very short-tempered guy, was a great guy in a firefight, but it was a guy that made up a lot of fights that went along too. I mean, you know, and I think he made E5 3 times while we were in Vietnam, because he'd make E5 and then he'd get in a fight with somebody, get busted down to E4, E3, and we go through the same cycle 2 or 3 times. But when the division went home, they had a bunch of stuff down in Bien Hoa. We went down to Bien Hoa, and they had a bunch of stuff. They took us to the airfield, and they had big signs on the side of the bus, "Screaming Eagles going home." And I was on the same bus with Malay, who I think was once again a Spec 4. And he was a guy that was so big that when he put a helmet on his head, it didn't come down, it was up here. He was just a huge person, and very strong, very quick. We're riding down the street, going to the airport, and somebody shouts, you know, something derogatory about the 101st, "Screaming Eagles eat shit," or something like that. Last time I saw Malay, he was chasing that guy down the street. Don't ever know what happened to him. Don't know what happened to that guy. Hope he didn't catch him, because I think he probably dented him some. But I came back and got married. I'd gotten engaged before I left. My future mother-in-law was a very good person, had some serious doubts about all this. And the plan was we would get married when I came back. My future mother-in-law put her foot down and said, "Well, you will not get married till after Christmas." And my wife said, "Good, December 26th. So he got married December 26th.
But when you came back to the country, you're coming back, you're still in service. You get like a 30-day leave or something on the return? Or how?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, where did you fly into in the States?
I ended up flying to Philadelphia. I think we went through Oakland.
Did you have any issues in the airport, or was this before there were protesters, or you just didn't see any if there were any?
I didn't see any.
Okay. All right. So you had to fly back to Philadelphia.
They were around, I didn't see them. And I think that I changed to civilian clothes in Oakland and flew across the country in civilian clothes because they're more comfortable. They gave us, they had to issue us, because nobody had them, a uniform to come back to the States in, because if you had, infantry guys had a hard time bringing back stuff because you're living out of your rucksack. And I remember I bought from the PX in Vietnam a reel-to-reel tape recorder, which at the time was kind of the high-end sound equipment. But I was going, you know, in the field. It was in the company storeroom. When I came back, it was time to go. It wasn't there anymore, and nobody knew where it was.
All right. Now we are about out of tape, so I'm going to stop
Okay.
it here.